The gavel's echo reverberated through the mahogany-paneled courtroom like thunder, each strike driving another nail into the Blackwood family's coffin. Victoria Sterling smoothed her cream-colored Chanel dress and allowed herself the smallest, most devastating smile. After 18 months of legal warfare, she had won. The court finds in favor of the plaintiff, Judge Patricia Rodriguez announced, her voice cutting through the stunned silence. DNA evidence conclusively establishes Thomas Sterling as the biological son of the late Marcus Blackwood, with all attendant inheritance rights. Victoria's heart raced with triumph as she felt the weight of every gaze in the packed courtroom. Behind her, photographers' cameras clicked like hungry insects, capturing this moment that would grace tomorrow's headlines. She turned slightly, her dark hair catching the light, as she sought out the faces of the family who had tried to destroy her. Helena Blackwood sat frozen in the front row, her silver hair perfectly coiffed despite the devastation written across her patrician features. At 65, Marcus's widow still possessed the regal bearing that had made her the undisputed queen of Manhattan society. But today her throne was cracking beneath her. Beside Helena, James Blackwood gripped the wooden bench until his knuckles went white. The 42-year-old heir apparently looked as though he'd been physically struck. His steel-gray eyes, so much like his father's, blazed with barely contained fury as they fixed on Victoria. She remembered those eyes from their brief, drunken encounter at the charity gala 5 years ago. Though she doubted he recalled much of that night, Sophia Blackwood, the youngest at 38, wept openly beside her brother. The accomplished architect's usual composure had finally shattered, her artistic sensibilities overwhelmed by the brutal reality of public humiliation. Victoria almost felt sorry for her, almost. "This was never about money," Victoria whispered to the reporter beside her, ensuring her voice carried just far enough to reach the Blackwood family. This was about a dying man's love for his son and a little boy's right to know his father. She thought of Tommy, safe at home with the nanny, blissfully unaware that his 4-year-old world had just been transformed. Those innocent blue eyes would never want for anything again. The Blackwood fortune built on Marcus's revolutionary software patents was now partially his birthright. Marcus Blackwood had been 70 when he died 6 months ago, his heart finally succumbing to the stress of building an empire worth $12 billion. But in his final years, he had found something more precious than money: love. Victoria had given him that gift, along with the son he'd always craved. The courtroom began to empty, but Victoria remained seated, savoring the moment. Her lawyer, Marcus Thorne, no relation to the family, despite the unfortunate coincidence of names, leaned over to whisper congratulations. His breath was warm against her ear, sending a familiar shiver down her spine. Their professional relationship had developed certain personal dimensions over the past year, moments of passion stolen between legal strategies and court appearances. "You did it," he murmured, his hand briefly touching her shoulder. "Tommy will never want for anything." "We did it," she corrected, remembering their late-night strategy sessions that had sometimes ended with them entangled on his office sofa. Documents scattered across the floor as they celebrated small victories with intimate embraces. As the Blackwood family filed out through a side door. Avoiding the media circus, Victoria caught Helena's eye one final time. The older woman's gaze was arctic, promising that this war was far from over. But Victoria had won the most important battle, and she had the court's verdict to prove it. Little did she know that Marcus Blackwood, even in death, still had one. Final move to play. The gavel's echo reverberated through the mahogany-paneled courtroom like thunder, each strike driving another nail into the Blackwood family's coffin. Victoria Sterling smoothed her cream-colored Chanel dress and allowed herself the smallest, most devastating smile. After 18 months of legal warfare, she had won. The court finds in favor of the plaintiff, Judge Patricia Rodriguez announced, her voice cutting through the stunned silence. DNA evidence conclusively establishes Thomas Sterling as the biological son of the late Marcus Blackwood, with all attendant inheritance rights. Victoria's heart raced with triumph as she felt the weight of every gaze in the packed courtroom. Behind her, photographers' cameras clicked like hungry insects, capturing this moment that would grace tomorrow's headlines. She turned slightly, her dark hair catching the light, as she sought out the faces of the family who had tried to destroy her. Helena Blackwood sat frozen in the front row, her silver hair perfectly coiffed despite the devastation written across her patrician features. At 65, Marcus's widow still possessed the regal bearing that had made her the undisputed queen of Manhattan society. But today her throne was cracking beneath her. Beside Helena, James Blackwood gripped the wooden bench until his knuckles went white. The 42-year-old heir apparently looked as though he'd been physically struck. His steel-gray eyes, so much like his father's, blazed with barely contained fury as they fixed on Victoria. She remembered those eyes from their brief, drunken encounter at the charity gala 5 years ago. Though she doubted he recalled much of that night, Sophia Blackwood, the youngest at 38, wept openly beside her brother. The accomplished architect's usual composure had finally shattered, her artistic sensibilities overwhelmed by the brutal reality of public humiliation. Victoria almost felt sorry for her, almost. "This was never about money," Victoria whispered to the reporter beside her, ensuring her voice carried just far enough to reach the Blackwood family. This was about a dying man's love for his son, and a little boy's right to know his father. She thought of Tommy, safe at home with the nanny, blissfully unaware that his 4-year-old world had just been transformed. Those innocent blue eyes would never want for anything again. The Blackwood fortune built on Marcus's revolutionary software patents was now partially his birthright. Marcus Blackwood had been 70 when he died 6 months ago, his heart finally succumbing to the stress of building an empire worth $12 billion. But in his final years, he had found something more precious than money: love. Victoria had given him that gift, along with the son he'd always craved. The courtroom began to empty, but Victoria remained seated, savoring the moment. Her lawyer, Marcus Thorne, no relation to the family, despite the unfortunate coincidence of names, leaned over to whisper congratulations. His breath was warm against her ear, sending a familiar shiver down her spine. Their professional relationship had developed certain personal dimensions over the past year, moments of passion stolen between legal strategies and court appearances. "You did it," he murmured, his hand briefly touching her shoulder. "Tommy will never want for anything." "We did it," she corrected, remembering their late-night strategy sessions that had sometimes ended with them entangled on his office sofa. Documents scattered across the floor as they celebrated small victories with intimate embraces. As the Blackwood family filed out through a side door. Avoiding the media circus, Victoria caught Helena's eye one final time. The older woman's gaze was arctic, promising that this war was far from over. But Victoria had won the most important battle, and she had the court's verdict to prove it. Little did she know that Marcus Blackwood, even in death, still had one final move to play. 3 years earlier, Victoria Sterling had been nothing more than Marcus Blackwood's executive assistant, filing reports and scheduling meetings in the gleaming tower that bore his name. But she possessed something more dangerous than ambition. She had patience and an uncanny ability to read the desires hidden in powerful men's hearts. Marcus had built his empire from a cramped garage in Queens, writing code that would revolutionize cloud computing. His marriage to Helena had been a perfect merger of old money and new innovation. She brought social connections and grace. He brought genius and relentless drive. For 40 years, they had been Manhattan's golden couple, weathering scandals and market crashes with united strength. Victoria saw the cracks in their seemingly perfect facade during late nights at the office. She noticed how Marcus's eyes lingered on the family photos on his desk, particularly one of James as a toddler. She heard the longing in his voice when he spoke of his children's accomplishments, always tinged with the regret of a father who had built an empire at the cost of being present. "Sometimes I wonder if they even know who I really am," Marcus confessed one evening as Victoria brought him coffee. Rain streaked the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse office. The city lights blurred into impressionist paintings below. Victoria had worn a fitted black dress that night, one that accentuated her curves without being inappropriate. She moved closer than necessary to set down his coffee, letting her perfume, a subtle blend of jasmine and vanilla, create an invisible web around them. "You're a man who changed the world," she whispered, her hand brushing against his as she adjusted the papers on his desk. "Your children are lucky to have you." That was the first crack in Marcus Blackwood's armor, and Victoria was patient enough to widen it slowly. She began staying later, offering to help with personal matters alongside business ones. She listened when Helena was too busy with her charity galas, offered comfort when James and Sophia seemed too caught up in their own lives to notice their father's growing isolation. The seduction was masterful in its subtlety. A gentle touch here, an understanding smile there. Victoria learned Marcus's favorite wine, his preferred music, the books that had shaped his worldview. She became indispensable, then irreplaceable, then irresistible. The night they first kissed, Victoria had orchestrated it perfectly. A late dinner meeting with overseas clients had run long, and she had suggested they continue the discussion over drinks at Marcus's private club. The conversation had flowed from business to philosophy, to the dreams they abandoned along the way to success. "I never got to be young," Marcus admitted, the whiskey making him more vulnerable than usual. "I went straight from my father's disappointment to building this company. Sometimes I feel like I missed the best parts of life." Victoria moved closer on the leather sofa, her hand finding his cheek. "It's not too late," she murmured, and when she kissed him, it was with a passion that made him feel 25 again. Their affair bloomed in secret stolen afternoons in Marcus's private apartment, weekend trips disguised as business conferences. Moments of intimacy that made the 70-year-old billionaire feel alive in ways he'd forgotten possible. Victoria was careful never to push too hard, never to seem calculating. She played the role of a woman genuinely in love with a powerful man, and perhaps, in quiet moments, she almost believed it herself. When she announced her pregnancy 2 years into their relationship, Marcus wept with joy. The child would be his second chance, his opportunity to be the father he'd never been to James and Sophia. Victoria had chosen the timing perfectly. Helena was distracted by a sick mother in Connecticut, and Marcus was facing his own mortality after a minor heart episode. "I want to do right by this child," Marcus promised, his hands gentle on Victoria's still flat stomach as they lay together in the afternoon sunlight of his hidden apartment. "I want to be present, to be the father I should have been." But Victoria had underestimated Helena Blackwood's intelligence and James's protective instincts. The family began to close ranks, sensing a threat they couldn't yet name. Private investigators were hired, financial records scrutinized, and slowly, the truth about Victoria's past began to emerge: the debts, the calculated relationships, the pattern of targeting wealthy, lonely men. The battle lines were drawn long before Tommy was born, and Victoria knew that winning would require more than just Marcus's love. It would require proof that couldn't be disputed, evidence that would stand up in court when the inevitable war began. The Blackwood mansion felt like a mausoleum as the family gathered in Marcus's study 3 hours after the devastating court verdict. The room still smelled of his cologne and Cuban cigars, a ghostly reminder of the man who had built an empire from nothing. Helena sat behind the massive oak desk, her composure intact despite the earthquake that had just shattered their world. Benjamin Cross, Marcus's oldest friend and estate executor, arrived precisely at 8 o'clock, carrying a briefcase that seemed to weigh more than its contents should allow. At 72, Benjamin moved with the careful dignity of a man who had kept other people's secrets for 5 decades. His relationship with Marcus went back to their Harvard days, when they were young men convinced they could conquer the world. "I apologize for the timing," Benjamin said, his voice soft with genuine sympathy. But Marcus was very specific about when this was to be opened. He placed a cream-colored envelope on the desk, sealed with dark red wax bearing the Blackwood family crest. The letter seemed innocuous enough, but something about it made the air in the room feel electric with anticipation. "What is it?" Sophia asked, her voice still hoarse from crying. She sat curled in the leather chair where she'd spent countless childhood hours listening to her father's stories about building his business. "A final letter from your father," Benjamin explained. "He gave it to me over a year ago with strict instructions. It was only to be opened after any legal proceedings regarding his alleged paternity were concluded regardless of the outcome." James paced to the window, his jaw clenched so tightly it looked painful. He knew this would happen. He knew that woman would try to destroy us. "Your father knew many things," Benjamin said carefully. "He was always several moves ahead of everyone else." Victoria Sterling had been summoned as well, though she arrived 20 minutes late, still basking in her courtroom victory. She wore the same cream dress, but had added a string of pearls, a not-so-subtle nod to her new status as part of the Blackwood family legacy. Her lawyer, Marcus Thorne, accompanied her, though his usual smugness seemed tempered by caution. "This is highly irregular," Thorne protested as they took seats across from the family. "The court has rendered its verdict. My client's son is legally recognized as a Blackwood heir, and this letter will not change that," Benjamin assured him. But it was Marcus's final wish that all parties hear his words. Helena's eyes never left Victoria's face as Benjamin carefully broke the wax seal. There was something almost predatory in the older woman's stillness, like a cat watching a mouse that doesn't yet know it's been spotted. Benjamin unfolded the heavy paper and cleared his throat. "To my beloved family and to Ms. Sterling," he began, reading in Marcus's voice from beyond the grave. "If you are hearing these words, it means the circus has ended and the truth is about to begin." Victoria shifted uncomfortably. The letter's tone was not what she had expected from a man who had whispered love letters in her ear and promised to take care of their son forever. "Let me start with you, Victoria," Benjamin continued reading. "I imagine you're feeling quite pleased with yourself right now. You've played your role masterfully, the grieving mistress, the protective mother, the woman wronged by a powerful family. It was truly an Oscar-worthy performance." The color began to drain from Victoria's face as the words sank in. This was not the loving vindication she had anticipated. "You see, my dear, you made one critical error in your elaborate scheme. You assumed I was nothing more than a lonely old fool, desperate for one last taste of youth and passion. In that, you were both right and catastrophically wrong." Benjamin paused, glancing at Victoria with something approaching pity. "I was indeed lonely, and you did make me feel young again. Our time together was ... memorable, but I didn't build a $12 billion empire by being naive about human nature." Helena allowed herself the smallest smile as she watched Victoria's confident facade begin to crumble like sand. "I know you're wondering how I discovered the truth." Benjamin continued reading Marcus's letter, his voice steady despite the escalating tension in the room. "It began with something small, a conversation with my doctor about Tommy's remarkable resemblance to my own baby pictures. Dr. Amanda Rivers has been my physician for 30 years. She knows things about my medical history that even Helena doesn't know. Victoria's breathing became shallow as the net began to close around her. Marcus Thorne reached for her hand, but she pulled away, her focus entirely on the words being read aloud. You see, Victoria, when I was 12 years old, I contracted a severe case of mumps. It was 1965, before vaccines were widely available. The fever nearly killed me, and the complications left me with a condition called azoospermia. In layman's terms, my dear scheming mistress, I have been completely and irreversibly sterile since adolescence. The silence that followed was deafening. James stopped pacing and stared at Benjamin, his mouth agape. Sophia's tears had stopped flowing, replaced by a dawning understanding. Helena's smile widened just a fraction, not cruel, but satisfied. No, Victoria whispered, shaking her head. The DNA test. It was conclusive. 99.9%. Benjamin turned the page and continued. Ah, yes, the DNA. Your masterstroke, or so you thought. Stealing my drinking glass during one of your visits to discuss Tommy's future. So clever, so dramatic. But you made a crucial error, Victoria. You assumed the only Blackwood DNA in that house was mine. James felt his legs go weak. The memory hit him like a physical blow that charity gala 5 years ago, the one where he'd had too much champagne and made a mistake he'd tried to forget. Victoria had been there, working the event, and she had been so understanding, so sympathetic. When he'd confessed his fears about living up to his father's legacy. The glass you so carefully pilfered had indeed been used by a Blackwood, Benjamin read on. Just not the one you intended. You see, James had stopped by my study that evening to discuss a business matter. He was thirsty, used the glass, and left just before you arrived for our ... appointment. Victoria turned to stare at James, her face a mask of horror and disbelief. The mathematical precision of her own trap was becoming clear. Tommy wasn't Marcus's son, he was Marcus's grandson. I believe there was a charity gala about 5 years ago. The letter continued with what could only be described as paternal amusement. Something about children's literacy, if memory serves. James, you've always been a lightweight when it comes to alcohol, and Victoria, you've always been opportunistic when it comes to vulnerable men. A dangerous combination. James sank into a chair, his face cycling through pale and flushed as the full implications hit him. He had a son he'd never known about, and that son was at the center of the most elaborate fraud in Manhattan's recent memory. By letting your scheme play out, Victoria, I accomplished 2 things, Benjamin continued reading. First, I gave you enough rope to hang yourself perjury, fraud, extortion. The list goes on. Second, and more importantly, I discovered I have a grandson. Tommy is innocent in all this, and he will be provided for, but not through my estate. Detective Ryan Walsh, who had been quietly observing from the back of the room, stepped forward with a grim expression. The NYPD had been investigating financial irregularities in Victoria's background for months, waiting for this moment. Victoria Sterling, Detective Walsh said, producing handcuffs. You're under arrest for fraud, perjury, and conspiracy to commit theft. You have the right to remain silent. Victoria's carefully constructed world collapsed in seconds. Marcus. Thorne was already gathering his papers, his professional relationship with his client clearly terminated. The woman who had walked into the courtroom that morning as a victor was now facing years in federal prison. But Marcus Blackwood's letter wasn't finished, and neither was his final gambit. As Detective Walsh led Victoria from the study in handcuffs, her protests echoing down the marble hallway, Benjamin Cross raised his hand for quiet. The most devastating revelation was yet to come. There is more, he announced, returning to Marcus's letter. While Miss Sterling was busy orchestrating her elaborate deception, I was conducting an investigation of my own, not into her background, but into mine. Helena frowned, sensing something in Benjamin's tone that suggested this. Final twist would shake even her carefully maintained composure. "My dear family," Benjamin read, "I have carried a secret for 50 years, one that has haunted every success, every triumph, every moment of happiness I've built with you. Before Helena, before the company, before I became the man you knew, I was someone else entirely." The letter's tone shifted, becoming deeply personal, weighted with decades of regret. "I was 20 years old, fresh out of Harvard, when I met Lillian Dubois. She was a photographer, a free spirit with eyes like storm clouds, and a laugh that could light up the darkest room. My father disapproved. She had no money, no connections, no value to the Blackwood name. He threatened to disown me if I continued seeing her." Sophia wiped her eyes, recognizing the pain in her father's posthumous confession. Helena sat perfectly still, but her hands trembled slightly as she processed this revelation about her husband's past. "I was a coward," the letter continued. "I chose family approval over love, money over happiness. I walked away from Lillian without explanation, taking a job in California to put distance between us. I told myself it was for the best, that we were too young, too different." Benjamin paused, glancing at the family before continuing. "What I didn't know until 2 years ago was that when I abandoned Lillian, she was pregnant with my child." The words hung in the air like smoke. James looked up from his own shock, and Helena's mask finally cracked, revealing raw emotion beneath her composure. "She never contacted me, never asked for money or support. She raised our son alone, working multiple jobs, never speaking ill of the father who had disappeared from their lives. She died of cancer when our boy was 30, taking my secret with her to the grave." Benjamin reached into his briefcase and withdrew a photograph, placing it on the desk where everyone could see. It showed a man in his 50s with kind eyes and calloused hands, standing beside a wooden cabin he had clearly built himself. "His name is Ethan Morrison," Benjamin continued reading. "He's a carpenter in Oregon, married to a wonderful woman named Claire, with 2 children of his own. He has Marcus's intelligence, but chose a quieter life, building homes instead of empires. When I found him 2 years ago and told him the truth, he was angry at first, not at me, but at the decades of wondering who his father was." The photograph showed a man who looked nothing like the polished Blackwood family, yet there was something unmistakably familiar in his features, the same determined jawline, the same intelligent eyes that had built a business empire. "I spent my final months getting to know my firstborn son," the letter revealed. "He is everything I hoped my children would be: grounded, honest, content with himself. He didn't want my money or my name. He just wanted to understand where he came from." Helena stood slowly and walked to the photograph, studying the face of her husband's secret son with a mixture of sadness and acceptance. "Therefore," Benjamin read the letter's conclusion, "while my business assets remain with my family as planned, my personal fortune, the liquid assets, investments, and properties held in my name alone, will be placed in trust for my firstborn son, Ethan Morrison, and his children." The room fell silent except for the ticking of Marcus's antique clock. $12 billion in business assets would remain with Helena, James, and Sophia, but Marcus's personal wealth, nearly $3 billion more, would go to the son he had never known he had. "There's a postscript," Benjamin said softly. "To Helena, you were the love of my life, and our children are my greatest pride. This doesn't diminish what we built together. To James and Sophia, you have a brother now, one who needs no inheritance to be worthy of the Blackwood name. To Victoria, the truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how deep you bury it." 3 months later, Ethan Morrison stood in the same study, his work-worn hands gentle as he embraced his half-siblings. Victoria Sterling was serving the first year of her sentence for fraud, while little Tommy was being raised by his aunt, far from the spotlight that had nearly destroyed him. Marcus Blackwood, even in death, had orchestrated the perfect victory justice served. Family secrets revealed, and a lifetime of regret finally redeemed through the discovery of a son. Had never needed his father's fortune to be truly rich.